Well, thank you all very much. And, there is an African proverb that says, if you're taking an elephant to the watering hole, it's best you drink first. And so following on from Sean, you can see how I'm feeling. What I want to do this morning is to divide this hour into 4 parts. I want to look at the biblical justification for the land of Israel and its history. Secondly, I want to look at what happened to the Jews outside of Israel, and therefore why a Zionist project was developed in Europe. Thirdly, I want to look at what happened from 1947-48 onwards. And finally, I want to look at those Christian groups that have been almost, we can say, more Zionist than the Jewish Zionists. And you will see the reason for that as the morning goes on. So that's the task of this hour. And over here, I've got my notes. So every time I disappear, it's a bit like Tommy Cooper, you come back up again. Okay, I've given you here some basic references, and you can copy them down, or you can photograph them, or you can ignore them as you please. But the crucial thing is to begin with the promise which is given to Abraham. Now, you remember, we sometimes speak of Abraham as our father in faith. So he was the one who displayed what faith in God means. Leave your father's house, leave everything you know, leave the land, and come to where I will lead you. Where's that, Gov? Come. So Abraham then is called to leave everything behind in faith in God alone. And the promise is, I will lead you to a new land. Therefore, the promise is at the heart of the whole thing. Now, you see, in Christianity and in Islam, we have no theology of land. You cannot say, this land is a Christian land. Politicians can say that when they're trying to score points. But the message of Jesus is a message which is universal. That's what tomorrow is all about. Why did they burst out, speaking in all the tongues of all those who were there, to show that this is not a message just for one group of people? Just in the same way, Islam understands itself as being a universal guidance for all humankind. Now, Judaism is different, and Judaism has a theology of the land. It's one of the fundamental beliefs. So we go back then to the promise to Abraham. Now, there are several references in the Hebrew Bible to the boundaries of the land. In other words, there is nothing consistent in the boundaries. This one, Genesis 15:18, talks about you will go to the land between the great river of Egypt, which is the Nile, and the great river, which is the Euphrates. Now that's a big expanse. Other times we read from the East River, that's the Jordan, to the West River, that's the Mediterranean. In other words, God doesn't give a map and say, this is like the land registry. This is your territory. And often you remember it's spoken of as the land of certain groups of people. Go into the land of the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, etc. Doesn't tell us exactly where the boundaries are. And that's one of our issues as time goes on. Where are the boundaries? It's also important to say that clearly it's a land which is already occupied, in use, it's populated. Go into this land. And you remember in the book of Joshua, we hear about go into this land and take possession of it, and put people to the sword. So if you read that literally, that's a kind of divinely commanded, let alone divinely endorsed, what we would today call ethnic cleansing. Now, you can see that's serious stuff. Now, it doesn't also say, and you will take possession of this land exclusively. Nobody else should be there, just you guys. Doesn't say that. And indeed, all the way down through the centuries, from possession of the land onwards, it was never exclusively populated by the descendants of Abraham, Moses, etc., the Hebrew people, the Jewish people. So there's always then this element of, even though it's our land, we have to share it. So that's the river to the river. Genesis 17 tells us this is a covenant. This is an everlasting covenant. It is yours in perpetuity, says God. Now you remember the whole idea of a covenant is that it is binding upon the parties throughout all time. It's not just a contract for a few years. So it's part of a covenant theology in which God will keep God's promises. God does not renege on the promises that God gives. So from a Jewish perspective, this is our everlasting, perpetual gift from God. Crucially important. You are to have a sign that you are my people and I am your God. And that goes with, this is your land and I am giving it to you. And that sign, you remember, you see it here again in Genesis 17, is the circumcision. You are to circumcise your males. Now, male adults, and from then onwards, male babies. And this is crucially important to understand the nature of Judaism. You are to circumcise your boy babies, because that is the sign of belonging to the people and therefore also of belonging to the land. Now you remember in the awful days of the ghettos and the Holocaust and so on, in the time of the Third Reich in Europe, boys who were born were circumcised. But that's going to mean they're going to get him. Yep. Well, if you didn't circumcise him, you could lie. Yep. But it is the perpetual sign of the covenant with God, and therefore it is to be done. Next we see, there are shades here. Because you remember, Genesis 23 tells you the story. Abraham's wife, Sarah, dies. And he's nowhere to bury her. So although he has come to this land, he doesn't feel, just because I'm here, I've occupied it and it's mine. So he turns to the local people, the Hittites, and he says, sell me this land so that I may bury my wife. A portion of land, including this cave. And they say to him, oh, look, Governor, you're a big, important man. We respect you. We honor you. It's a gift. And no, he says, thank you very much. Don't want a gift. I want to purchase it. It's yours. I want to buy it. And if you read Genesis 23, you will see that there's a real to and fro going on here. Oh, come on, we want to give it to you. No, not having it. And in the end, he buys it so that he has somewhere that as it were, he owns in order that he can bury his wife Sarah. Now, this is a very important step. You see, it's not, as it were, a belligerence. It is a respectful living together. Now, that's Abraham. Genesis 26 and 28, if you look those up, you will see that this covenant is repeated. It's repeated with Isaac, it's repeated with Jacob, it's handed down amongst our people. And it's handed down amongst our people in perpetuity because it's the everlasting covenant of God. Therefore, it becomes a central element of faith. You know, if you were to think of drawing up, as it were, the statements of a Jewish creed, one of those statements would be, this is the land the Lord has given us in perpetuity, forever. So that's the starting point. Now again, it's not as simple as it looks, because I am faithful to my covenant, but you blighters aren't always faithful. And when you leave my ways and enter into sin, stuff can happen. And you remember then that the Jews are taken off into exile. Not once, but twice. First of all, 721 BCE, BC, you know what that is. The northern kingdom is overrun, the people are sent into exile. And again, 586, the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, Jerusalem, etc., temple destroyed, rich people taken off into exile. Who are left? The poor people of the land. So there's always this important Jewish understanding that there have always been Jews living in the land. Even though our people were taken off into exile, you can read Second Book of Kings, it's always some were left, and these were the poor people of the land. The poor people of the land tend to be less sinful than the rich people who were swinging the lead. They're the ones who were taken off into exile. So again, there are your references, 2 Kings, and you remember Jeremiah is the prophet of the exile. And he is constantly saying to people, return to faithfulness, God is faithful, we will return. And important, of course, to remember, 586, the beginning of the exile in Babylon. First of all, Jews lived in Babylon from that time onwards up until the 20th century. So 2,600 years of living in what we would today call Iraq, Mesopotamia. 2,600 years, cohabitation, living together, side by side. Secondly, who was the person who God uses to bring them back to the land, to restore the vessels of the temple, to give them building materials? Cyrus the Persian. Cyrus the Persian. He's not a Jew. So it's one of those very important signs in the scriptures that God can work through other people outside the community to bring about, as it were, the promises of God, the will of God for the faithful community. So that's Cyrus who brings the Jews back to the land. And of course, they come back and They rebuild the temple, etc., etc. Now, Judaism then, from that time onwards, even before that, from the time of Solomon onwards, is essentially a temple religion. It's a temple religion. The temple is in Jerusalem. We go up to Jerusalem. Now, you know, the whole land of Israel isn't all that big. So you can go up to Jerusalem just with a bit of effort and some good leather. The temples we are at the moment, this week, is the great festival of Shavuot, the festival of weeks. You know, a week of weeks, 49 days, Pentecost, you got the picture. So this is the festival of weeks that comes 50 days, a week of weeks after Passover. And it's one of the three great pilgrimage festivals. Everybody goes up to the temple, everybody who can. Now, that becomes crucial because we come down here to the bottom, you see, because down here, we've got the expulsion of the Jews. This is not exile, this is expulsion. And you'll remember that in the year 70 of the Common Era, the temple is destroyed. Now, obviously, no more temple-based Judaism. What are we going to do, lads? Because that was our understanding of religion. That was our understanding, the whole focus of what we did. And so you get a shift in Judaism at this time from being temple-based to being, we can say, synagogue-based. Now, synagogues existed before that, but now there are only synagogues and daily living. When Liz and I were in Birmingham, we worked there with a couple of Jewish rabbis, and one of them used to have very good little sayings, as Jewish rabbis often do. And he would say to us, it wasn't the synagogue that kept Judaism alive in Europe through all the years of exile. It was the dining table, the family table where we gathered every Sabbath to share together, to eat together as a family, to retell the stories of our people, to study the Torah, to study the faith. So you can see it's the dining table, it's the family life, it's the belongingness that keeps us going after the expulsion. Now, 70, temple destroyed. 135, the Bar Kokhba revolt, finito. After this, all but a small group of Jews are driven out of the land of Palestine until the contemporary period. And that small group are the followers of Gamaliel, the great Pharisee. And the insight of the Pharisees was we have to shift to studying the scriptures, the synagogue, and to how you live the daily life. And this is what keeps Judaism alive through the years of exile. So that gets you into the land, losing the land, regaining the land, finally losing the land in the immediate post-Christian period. Now remember, they're not driven out by Christians. Christians are a very insignificant group at this time. They're driven out by Romans on political grounds. You are an awkward bunch who keep revolting. So we'll stop you because we will scatter you, we will drive you out, and that will stop your nonsense. So that gets us that far. That's the end of part one. Now what we need to do is to go and look at what happens after the Jews have left the land of Palestine. The land is now not at the center of their daily practice, but it is at the center of their thoughts and their prayers. You know that through all those years of exile, many festivals, many gatherings for prayer would end with the words, "Next year in Jerusalem." Next year in Jerusalem. Our sights were always set on that. Now, up until now, we've essentially been looking at the religious justification for the land. Now I want to see the development of the socio-political movement, which we're going eventually to call Zionism. Okay? Because what happens then is that the Jews are driven out and they are scattered. Now, they're scattered along the coast of North Africa as far as Morocco. They're scattered, that's west. They're scattered eastwards up into Syria. Already they're in Iraq. And some of them cross over into Spain. Now, remember, this is before the creation of Spain and Portugal. So when we say Spain, we mean the lot, the Iberian Peninsula. Now, the Jews established themselves in Spain, and of course, they are coming then under Christian rule, as Spain is gradually Christianized. Then in 711, Muslims begin to arrive, and from 711 to 756, you gradually get the introduction of Muslim rule, so that by 756, Muslim rule has reached the Pyrenees. Now that's like the cap on the lid. Except for over on the northwest corner, Castile and Aragon, that remains Christian. When I say remains Christian, I mean it is ruled by Christian rulers, whereas the rest is ruled by Muslim rulers. But of course, the people are Christians, Jews, and Muslims. And they are living together in a very kind of creative academic mix. Now, we don't need to get romantic about this. Doesn't mean that this was, paradise on earth. Sometimes, things could have been difficult, especially for little people. But it means that the big people got on really well together because they were the learned people. Now, this was a time of great intellectual flourishing. So if you go to the year 1000, in Cordoba, the capital of Spain, the great library of Cordoba, the University of Cordoba, was the most important university in the whole of Europe. So Christians, Christian monks, people who will later become pope, whatever they are, okay? People who later become pope, coming down to Cordoba to study. It was the center of learning. Now, the year 1000, that's 250 years before the founding of the great universities of Europe, okay? Paris, Oxford, Salamanca, Bologna, and so on. So they were way ahead of the game here. People like Moses Maimonides, who is regarded by Jewish scholars as being the greatest Jewish theologian of the medieval period, Maimonides grows up in Spain. He writes in Arabic. He is an Aristotelian philosopher, and he actually systematizes the Jewish way of life and belief in that period. Now, he actually ends up in Egypt because Spain, by this stage, is coming under Christian reconquest. And so you get it from the year, let's say, 1031 up until 1298, those 250 years, you get the Christians pushing down, Muslim rule pushing back, Christian rule pushing down, until eventually Muslim rule is just confined to the Kingdom of Granada, right down on the Mediterranean. Now, this was not a good time to be a Jew or a Muslim in Spain. Much better to be a Christian or a Jew under Muslim rule in Spain than to be a Jew or a Muslim under Christian rule in Spain. And as the story goes on, you will see that rule applies right the way up through Europe. Much better to be a Jew living under Muslim rule in Turkey, in Iraq, in Iran, in Syria, in Egypt, all the way along to Morocco, than to be a Jew living under Christian rule in Europe. And what happens then is Jews are persecuted by Christians, by Christian rulers, successively, coming from the south in Spain and moving northwards. You may have heard, I think it was last week, that President Macron announced that Dreyfus, Captain Dreyfus, you remember, perhaps, who was the Jewish officer who was accused of treason without any real evidence at all, but in a period that was dramatically anti-Semitic, he was stripped of his office and sent into exile in Guyana. Dreyfus was rehabilitated last week. Now, Dreyfus actually died in 1935, but he was, in 1894, it was the Dreyfus scandal, the Dreyfus affair, the Dreyfus cut. So that's just one incident. Now, what happens then is Jews are pushed further and further north in Europe. And I just want to exemplify that by looking here in Britain. You see, if you go to the year 1190, now this is just after the Crusades. Crusaders are coming back, etc. Whatever else the Crusaders did, some of them had a strong faith. And therefore, picking on Jews was part of the spirit of the age. Now, let's look at the Jews coming up through Europe then during this period. First of all, you remember, the Christian rulers forbade Jews to own land. What do you do with your money? Well, you have to keep it, as we would say, in liquid assets, gold and jewels, for example. If you are forbidden to own land, and you are being moved from place to place, well, it's not too easy if you're a blacksmith to load up your tools and put your anvil on your back and clear out at night. But if you're a goldsmith, you can roll up all your tools in a little pouch in your pocket and you're on your way. So Jews were associated with these kind of crafts that were portable. Secondly, remember that Christians were forbidden from interest. It was immoral, illegal for Christians, according to their theology and practice, to lend or take money on interest up until Calvin, Geneva, 1556, I think, or 65. They're a bit fuzzy in my brain. So what do you do? Because you see, you've got Christian princes who want to wage war, therefore they need money. Where do they go for the money? You go to the Jewish money lenders. Now, don't tell this to your bank manager, but a really good way of dealing with excessive debt is to drive the bankers out of town, because then you don't owe them money anymore. And that's part of what happened You borrow money off the Jewish bankers, you can't pay it back. Let's drive them out, lads. So you can see, now those are two, as it were, socio-political elements. But there's also a third element, and that is the theological element. Because Christian theology was saying, you, the Jews, killed Jesus. You, the Jews, would not recognize the Messiah. Therefore, we have the crime of deicide. Notice the bricks. You killed God. You killed Jesus. Now, this got people really stormed up. Not surprising, local stories went around. During Passover, they come and grab and kidnap Christian babies, drain their blood for their rituals. Now, you've got a theology here. We have to be honest and say that the persecution of Jews in Europe was partly based on Christian theology. Now, if you read Martin Luther on the Jews, well, you better be sitting down when you read it, because it is not pleasant stuff. Now, you read that, and then you think of the Third Reich and the way in which Christians in the Third Reich in Germany, as it were, gave a momentum to Hitler and to his persecution of Jews. So you cannot ignore the Christian theological element. Now, if we go back to York, you see all that going on, you see, because when they came back from the Crusades, full of Christian vigor, as it were, remember who they are, they're the Jews. We owe them money. Some of the noble families up in Yorkshire owed them money. Therefore, they were driven into the Tower in York Castle. And in 950, about 150 of them died. Most of them died by their own hands. So you remember Masada, the last Jewish stand going back to the time of the expulsion? Rather than let them kill us, let's have mass suicide. The same happened in York. Fathers killed their wives, they killed their children, they killed each other, and in the end, the rabbi killed the secular leader, and then the rabbi killed himself. Now, there were some who didn't want to commit suicide. So they tried to give in to to go over to the enemy and surrender. So they were massacred. So it was a bad piece of story. But of course, 100 years later, in 1290, Jews are expelled from England altogether. Out you go, the lot of you. And they're not allowed back in until 1656. Now you remember, that's Brother Cromwell. Yeah? Cromwell and the Republic. Cromwell allows the Jews to come back into Britain, into England. So that's just one little episode in the history then of what is going on all over Europe. Jews are being pushed further and further north, further and further east, so that we know by the time of the rise of the Hitler regime, they are concentrated in Germany, in Poland, and in the Russias, going over that way. So, driven up further and further. Now, what happens? Now, being in a good Methodist house, you will remember, if I say the year 1809, this is a time of great revivalism amongst Christians. You know, this is just after the time of the Wesleys. There is all over England as it were, a revival of faith and practice and of reading the Bible. Now, reading the Bible, people began to see, Christian people began to see, that there was a promise to the Jews that they should be in the land of Israel. And therefore we get the development of the Christian restorationists. And they begin from the beginning of the 19th century. The Jews have a right to be in that land, therefore they should be back there. So you're going to be working here toward a kind of Christian push for the restoration of the Jews to the land of Palestine. Before there's any Jewish movement in this way. Now, a key character then is a man called William Heckler, 1885. William Heckler was the Anglican chaplain in Vienna, and he belonged to this Christian restorationist movement, and he wrote a book, and the book was called Restoration of the Jews to the Land of Palestine, approximately. Now, look where we are, 1885. He's in Vienna. Who else is in Vienna? A guy called Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl is a secular Jew. In other words, he is Jewish by ancestry and by birth. He belongs to the Jewish people, but it doesn't mean that he's a super religious character. So he is the father of Zionism. Zionism is a secular political movement because it is the only way, Herzl says, that we can save our people from this ongoing persecution. All across Europe, we are being persecuted. And the only way that we can be spared that is to have a land of our own. And we must have a land of our own. We must control it so that our people will always have an escape route. Now, that then is the creation of the idea of modern Zionism. But you see its history there in the religious tradition and so on. An escape route. We've got to have a bolt hole. Now, the contemporary state of Israel has as a fundamental part of its constitution, every Jew, wherever you are in the world, has a right to migrate to Israel and to take up citizenship. You see there the whole idea of a bolt hole. Wherever the pressure comes on you, you now have somewhere to go. If we'd had that in the 1930s, etc. Therefore, you see this movement for a land. In 1897, Theodor Herzl convenes the first Zionist conference in Vienna. And the whole thrust of that is, in order to preserve our people, we must have a land that we control. We control it, which means we can never again become a minority. Oh, yes, you can stay here, that's fine, you're nice people, we like you, until we change our minds. We need to control it. Very important principle to think about as we move forward. Sorry, zipping over a page now. Now, we know that the land of Palestine is partitioned in 1947. What happens before partition? Now, we'll go into more statistics and detail in the second half when we're looking from the Palestinian perspective. But basically what happens is that from that, the second half of the 19th century onwards, Jewish people are moving to Palestine. They are moving to Palestine and settling there from wherever they're coming from. Now, you will remember that in the 1930s, Britain controlled the land of Palestine. And Britain then controlled those who could migrate to Palestine. So you had waves of Jewish migration with Britain in control, and Britain trying to control that movement. Now, it was Britain who set up the concentration camps on Cyprus, so that, I mean, where did people like, Cameron and Johnson and their mates get the idea? So that you could put your refugees, migrants, your asylum seekers, as it were, offshore somewhere else and keep them out of the way. And so Jews who already saw how things were going in Europe in the 1920s and 30s, when they were trying to get out and to go to Palestine, it was the British who kept them out and corralled them in Cyprus. And why? Well, we'll look at that in more detail after coffee, because this is a complex story. But there were Jews then who were migrating to Palestine, and they were settling there. Now, we often hear about kibbutz and kibbutzim, in this present talk, and after the 7th of October and so on. Now, the kibbutz were a secular attempt at communal living. A secular attempt at communal living. So there was a strong, as it were, communist understanding behind some of those Jews who migrated to Palestine. They're trying to then buy land, take it over, farm it, establish their settlements, their kibbutzim. So all this movement then is going on in the 1920s and 30s. Now, there it is. End of part 2. Let's go on from this. The Zionist conference, Theodor Herzl, and so on. This starts a whole movement amongst Jewish intellectuals to think we have got to have a place of our own. Now, where that place should be is open to discussion. Remember, this is the time of the great European empires. Now, the imperial powers, of course, owned vast swathes of land, and you could dispose of it. In other words, you say you live here and you live there. Well, we didn't bother to ask you, of course, but you live there. So there was then a project to move the Jews to a part of South America, part of Argentina. There was a project to give the Jews part of Uganda. They actually started building housing for them there. Now, the first movements of this Zionist movement, this Jewish Zionist movement, were saying, we need a piece of land. Where? Secondary. But then, of course, next year in Jerusalem. So the idea of we ought to be going to Palestine grows and grows amongst people, both religious and secular Jews. The British are given the mandate for Palestine at the end of the First World War. You remember that Palestine, Syria, Iraq, all the Arabian Peninsula, these are all part of the Ottoman Empire up until the First World War. The Ottomans sided with the Germans, they lost. Therefore, the British and the French essentially are the victors. You've now got some new real estate. And so they got a map. There was a Mr. Sykes and Monsieur Picot, and they got a map and they drew lines on it. And they said, let's divide up the Ottoman lands into areas under British rule, areas under British influence, areas under French rule, areas under French influence, and then there's the land of Palestine. Now remember, you've not asked the people about this. That's irrelevant. Guess who won the land? So we decided to divide it up. Now, we then assigned kings, you remember? Because, the British are pretty good at double dealing. You've promised land to different people and so on. But crucially, Britain has the mandate for what we will now call the land of Palestine in the modern period. Because before that, in the Ottoman period, it was the province of Palestine in what was then called Greater Syria. But the British and the French divided up Greater Syria into modern-day Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan. Okay, those four countries are created by the British and the French after the First World War. Now, the British have the mandate for Palestine, 1918 onwards. But already we can see this is coming up because Sykes and Picot was 1916. Now, there is a very important Jewish chemist. I don't mean a guy who gives out drugs. I mean the professor of chemistry at Manchester University called Chaim Weizmann. And Chaim Weizmann is persuaded to become the leader, if you like, of a movement to persuade the British government that when they get control of Palestine, then they should endorse a Jewish homeland there. Chaim Weizmann is a friend of Arthur Balfour, who in 1917 is the British Foreign Secretary. Arthur Balfour is one of those Christian restorationists. He wants to see the biblical promise fulfilled, Jews going back to the land of Palestine. Weizmann, Balfour Declaration, 1917. The British government is minded to see the creation of a Jewish homeland in the land of Palestine, provided that the rights of the non-Jewish population are in no way the civil and the community rights, cultural, whatever, are protected. And provided that this does not affect the status of Jews who have citizenship in other country. In other words, Britain, France, etc., had an established Jewish community who were deeply woven into our society and with whom we really wanted to keep. So we didn't want them bunking off to Palestine to form the new state of Israel, unless they really wanted to. I mean, they're free to, but we'd like to keep you here because you're leading financiers, you're leading academics, you're leading lawyers, etc. So that this is the state then of the Balfour Declaration, 1917. The British then, during the Mandate years, 1920 up to 1947, they try to hold the fort in Palestine. The mandate says you, the British, are responsible for being a guardian, a protector of the land, and bringing the people of that land to a position where they can rule themselves. See, I mean, because we are, after all, the British. We understand how these things should be done. Therefore, when you have learned how to do things properly, then off you go. Then you will get independence. You see the mentality. I mean, it's there all across the British Empire. French Empire, same thing, again and again. Dutch, wherever you are, Belgians, etc. These are tough times. From 20 to 47, now again, we'll see the statistics after coffee, you get an increasing number of Jews who are migrating to Palestine. You get tensions with the local indigenous people until you come to a stage when in 1947, the British decide this is too hot for us to handle. Therefore, we do what we do best. We passed it on to the United Nations. Now, remember, the United Nations only formed in 1945. So it's a very embryonic body dominated by the victors from the Second World War. When you look today, who's got the permanent seats on the Security Council? Who's got the veto powers? We saw one exercised a couple of days ago. Who's got the veto powers? They are the victors from the Second World War up to today. So it's not entirely a neutral body. Now, you've got lots and lots of what we used to call DPs, displaced persons. Yeah? You've got them coming out of the concentration camps, coming out of the ghettos. They are in a dreadful state. America, the land of the free, open your arms. Not today, son. Yeah. Britain, excuse me. So what do we do? Well, we're going to support the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. That is the 1947 Partition Act. Okay? You can see the thinking that goes behind it. Now, that means a Jewish state, a Jewish homeland, is given part of Palestine in 1947. To come to fulfillment in 1948. Now, I want to read you sections of the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel. The date is the 14th of May, 1948. The speaker is David Ben-Gurion, who is the first prime minister. So this is right at the top of the tree. The statement of the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel. And it says as follows, in English translation. The State of Israel will promote the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. The State of Israel will be based on the precepts of liberty, justice, and peace as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. The State of Israel will uphold the full social and political equality of all its citizens without distinction of race, creed, or sex. The State of Israel will guarantee full freedom of conscience, worship, education, and culture. The State of Israel will safeguard the sanctity and inviolability of the shrines and holy places of all religions. The State of Israel will dedicate itself to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Now, I have taken that translation from a Jewish rabbi author. Therefore, I think it's a pretty reasonable translation. Now you can see That may have been what it said on paper, but it wasn't entirely what happened on the ground. Because what happened on the ground was, even before that was read, you had several Jewish groups, you remember, the Irgun, the Sterngan, the Haganah, and so on, who would meet every justification for what we would today call terrorists, who were operating in Palestine. Operating not just against the Palestinian non-Jews, but also against the British. You remember the bombing of the King David Hotel, 93 lost their lives, the hanging of the British sergeants, you remember, and so on. These were all things that encouraged the British to think, it's time we left. Now, of course, what happened is that when the United Nations Declaration, which was made at the end of 47, November, I think, of 47, to come into force in May of 48, during that period, Palestinians who are not Jews, because remember there are Palestinian Jews, we'll come on to them after the break. Palestinians who are not Jews, Christians and Muslims, are encouraged to leave their homes. Now, I use the word encouraged here. Other people would say they were driven out at gunpoint. They are encouraged to leave their homes in that territory that the Jewish state wants to take over. The figure generally accepted is 750,000 Palestinian refugees. That's a whole heap of people. Now, when you hear of UNRWA, the United Nations Relief, Refugee and Welfare Agency, it was created to look after those refugees. These refugees are driven into areas like Gaza, like the West Bank, but also into Jordan, into Lebanon, and some of them go across into Egypt. Now, you will see a symbol. If you see somebody going around with a key on their lapel or on their bag, it's quite likely that that key, and a kind of, an old-fashioned door key, not a modern Yale or Chubb job, but a mortise lock, that key is the symbol of Palestinians who were forced from their homes at this time. And we want the house back that the key belongs to. Of course, the reality was, in that sweep, not only were the people encouraged to leave, but also their homes, their villages were destroyed. Now, all that comes up into 1948, which is called the War of Independence. And from that time onwards, Israel has been pretty much perpetually in a state of siege with its Palestinian neighbors. 1967, the Six-Day War, Israel takes control of the whole of historic Palestine, including Gaza, including the West Bank, and so on. And gradually, things happen so that the Jewish settlers are taken out of Gaza by the Israeli government. We've got to try and find some way of a settlement here. Yom Kippur War, 1973, more territory, Golan, and so on. So a history of wars, a history of increasing the land under the occupation of Israel. Now, it depends whether you put the occupation with a small o or with a big O. Because, of course, the Palestinian rhetoric would say these are the occupied territories, whereas the Jewish rhetoric would say we are occupying historic Israel. That's why we call it Judea and Samaria and not the West Bank. Now you remember Mike Huckabee, the new American ambassador to Israel, will not speak about the West Bank. He will only speak about Judea and Samaria, because he belongs to a group that we're going to call the Christian Zionists. And that's the last part we're going to look at before we break for coffee. So just keep breathing for a bit longer. Just to sharpen our perception, Haaretz, the Jewish Israeli newspaper, which is regarded as being the liberal newspaper of Israel. Haaretz did a survey, an opinion poll, amongst Israeli Jews within the last couple of months. And their findings were that 82% of those Jewish Israelis wanted the Palestinians cleared out of Gaza. Now you can see the logic and the argument behind that. 56% wanted the Palestinian Israelis to be driven out, or to be sent out. Driven is a pejorative term. To be sent out from Israel. Now, about 1 million Israelis today are Palestinians. They have remained there during the time of the Israeli state rule. So they have Israeli passports. So we call them the Palestinian Israelis. That's what I call them. Israelis tend to call them the Arab Israelis, because don't use the word Palestinian, you see? Now, again, Israeli Jewish opinion, 56% of them should be expelled from the land of Israel. This is tough stuff, you know? Tough stuff. More on that later. Back to our Christian Zionists. I don't think we have anything exciting just to turn the page for. No, we haven't. That's good. Right. Back to our Christian restorationists. You see, the word Zionist with a Christian adjective can have a couple of meanings. It can mean a Christian who believes in the establishment of a Jewish state, who believes that it's the right thing to happen. Now, Joe Biden often used to call himself a Catholic Zionist. He'd belong to that group. So Christians who say it's the right thing that there should be a Jewish state in the land of Palestine. So that's one group. But then there's another group. And these, technically, specifically, we're calling Christian Zionists. Now, these are not an insignificant group. If you think in America, it is reckoned that there are about 100 million evangelicals in America. Evangelical here doesn't tend to mean quite what it might mean in a British context. This would tend to be what we call the Bible Belt. People who have a literal interpretation of taking the Bible literally. So, for example, people who will not accept any understanding of evolution, God created it 6 days, boom, 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 there you go, etc. Now, one of the tendencies then of this Christian evangelical movement in the States is to say that biblical prophecies must be fulfilled and to apply them to today. So, for example, we saw that Jeremiah was prophesying the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. Well, that was way back in the 6th century BC. These guys are interpreting that today. The prophecy of God is that the Jews must return to the land. So therefore, you are seeing, as it were, a Christian theological, biblical justification for the creation of the land of Israel, the state of Israel, a Jewish homeland. The term fundamentalist was invented to talk about these people, about Christian evangelicals in the Bible Belt of the southern states of America who read the scripture absolutely literally. Therefore, we called them fundamentalists. It's not a term that they give themselves. They would say that they are true Christian believers, of course. Important to say, we know, don't we, that the Hebrew scriptures are called that because they were originally written in Hebrew. And they are later translated into Greek. And of course, the New Testament is written in Greek. But we are not to think that all these Christian evangelical fundamentalist literal interpreters of the scriptures are reading the Hebrew and Greek. They are instead most likely reading King James. King James, 17th century. Now, we know today that when they translated the King James Bible, they didn't have access to the best Hebrew and Greek manuscripts. 17th century, Christianity in Europe divided, Codex Vaticanus kept in the Vatican Library. Don't think you're getting that one, son. The Codex Vaticanus is regarded as being the oldest complete manuscript of the Hebrew and Greek scriptures, you see. So they didn't have access to it, and lots of other things besides. That's why, we get things like the Revised Standard Version, the New Revised Standard Version, etc., because when we get better manuscripts and we can, get things going a bit better, we get a better understanding, therefore a better translation. So these guys are fundamentalist on King James. Now, of these 100 million, about between 30 and 40 million would say that they are Christian Zionists. And the Christian Zionists are deep into something called dispensationalism. Now, to understand dispensationalism, you need to just give your head a little shake, because it isn't easy. Now, what they are saying is this: a dispensation is a period of time. Now, if you read Revelation chapter 20, you will read there talk of Jesus and a reign of 1,000 years, a millennium. So sometimes we call them millenniumists, Christian dispensationalists, okay? Now, how do mainstream Christianity, and I mean here from Augustine, Calvin, Luther, Western Church today, can't really speak for the Eastern Church, but I guess it's the same, regard Jesus as the completion of that period, and therefore we live in the time of the kingdom of heaven, as it were. Now, these lads, the Christian Zionists, do not give it that interpretation. They will say that we are living in a time awaiting the dispensation of 1,000 years. So the way it goes is like this. Number one, Israel must return to the land of Palestine. Number two, then God will call the true believers up to heaven. This is the rapture. The rapture, okay? So you're talking here about Lindsay, Hal Lindsay, and Lahai, these guys, the Left Behind series, The Last Great Planet, Earth, etc. True believers. Now, you may not be part of this group. I confess that I am not. True believers, raptured off to heaven, meet Christ in the sky. You remember that verse? On the earth, then, we have now entered into the time of tribulation. And this time of tribulation will result in the great battle of Armageddon. And the true believers, looking down from the heavens, will watch as the people of the earth destroy themselves, including the Jews. They may convert to Christianity, in which case they may be saved. If they don't, then they will be destroyed. Well, then there's another period. This is a period of 1,000 years in which Christ returns to establish the kingdom of heaven on earth, the millennium, 1,000-year rule. Now, another way, if you go to, as it were, the hard line of this position, it will say that at the rapture, the church will be removed, and Israel, that is the Jewish people, will again become God's primary agent in the world. God's promises are irrevocable. Jews will recognize Christ as the Messiah at the second coming, and Jews will either convert or they will be killed at Armageddon. In other words, what they're saying is, you've got one period of time, which is God's promise to the Hebrew people, the promise of the land, etc., Abraham, Moses, and so. Then you've got a kind of time in a bracket. And the time in a bracket is what we're in at the moment, the sort of Christian period. You know, Jesus and Christians, okay, in a bracket. And now God will, at the end of this bracket, yank the true believers up to heaven, and then the promises will go back to the pre-bracket time, that is, to the Jews. So at that time, the Jews will again become the chosen people. Now, therefore, for a Christian Zionist, we must have the Jews in Israel in order to bring about the last times, bring about the return of Jesus, bring about the rapture of the true believers to heaven, which of course is us, and then Armageddon, sorted out amongst yourselves, chaps. So that is, again, a Christian impetus into this Jewish occupation of the land understanding. And do not think that this is a bunch of crackpots up some back street in America, because these guys were hugely influential behind the Bush White House, Reagan. Now, I don't imagine that you think that Donald Trump is the epitome of all the Christian virtues. And yet we know that it was largely Christian evangelists who were the impetus to get him elected, because we want what he's going to give us. God can use Cyrus of Persia. God can use Donald Trump. Jerry Falwell, all those televangelists, they're all coming out of this school. And therefore a huge amount of money. And if you talk to Palestinian Christian leaders and say, you know, yeah, America's a problem, they say, yeah, but not American Jews. They're a small problem. It's the American Christian Zionists. They're the big problem. They're the driver behind the situation. They're the driver behind the money. And there we will stop for coffee. We need it.